All right. Well, welcome to our next session here. Again, I want to welcome Brian and Hamaad to the stage, and I'll have them do a self-introduction in a second. But I think again, just on the heels of hearing how APL has been doing some great things internationally. Certainly, when we think of the sneaker market, and if you have a teenage son, as we do in our household, you know how in demand these products really are. So very interested to hear more. Brian, let's just start with you. We want to give a self-introduction, and then we'll go to Hamaad.
Sure. I'm Brian Burke. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at SEKO Logistics. We're headquartered in Chicago. That's where our global headquarters is. We have regional headquarters in Hong Kong and London. We are a global cross-border e-commerce shipping provider. We also have fulfillment centers around the world, and we've just launched a SEKO e-commerce division. So we work in all things 3PL, freight forwarding, and e-commerce shipping all around the world.
Hey everyone, Hamaad Akmal, head up international operations and global logistics at GOAT. GOAT, if you don't know, is the most trusted marketplace on the planet for sneakers and apparel, as you can see by my footwear today. And by the way, I look at everyone's footwear when they walk in the door, and I do make judgments about what you are. So, but yeah, excited to be here and partnering with SEKO. In fact, we had our first airlift last night out of Hong Kong, so super excited about that.
We timed it for this event.
Good to hear. Well, Hamaad, give a little the GOAT backstory, if you don't mind.
Sure. So, GOAT has a very kind of a typical founder story. We have two gentlemen, Daishin Sagano and Eddie Liu. These were roommates, or friends rather, at Berkeley, and then after graduation decided to team up and came up with an idea that kind of combined what we know today as LinkedIn, Facebook, Yelp, and kind of meshed it all up together. This is probably about 9 years ago, and wanted to have people meet up at restaurants in an effort to make business connections, professional connections, and friendships, and got funding for it, for their app idea. And it wasn't getting the traction that they needed or that they had hoped for. And while that was happening, Daishin, who's a big a sneakerhead as well as a big basketball fan and a Kobe fan, ordered a pair of Air Jordan 1s from eBay, and I think he spent around $300 or $400 on the shoes, and they showed up and they were fake. And so this was, it started to be a common problem that they realized that needed just a better way of being handled. And so they went back to their investors and said, look, this app idea isn't working so well, but we've got this other idea. And talk about pivot from basically social over to sneakers. And that's basically how the idea was born.
Give us a sense of how fast the business has grown, and how GOAT really positions in the marketplace.
Sure. So when we began about 5-6 years ago, we were just in the United States, and about 2019 we had opened up our first international location, which was in Hong Kong, with about maybe 10 people. Fast forward to today, we have nearly a $4 billion valuation, and we are in 8 different countries with 10 different locations within those 8 countries. And instead of 10 employees, we have hundreds and hundreds of employees internationally.
Oh, that's great. And we'll talk more about the supply side, these
Yep.
challenges here in a second. But before we kind of get more into the GOAT international footprint, Brian, you heard it in our opening remarks. You heard it in the executive keynote leaders panel. Obviously, global logistics has been a huge issue. Certainly around the world. As e-commerce has been growing everywhere. You guys are on top of this. Just explain a little of what has been the biggest challenges for a lot of brands trying to sell overseas over the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely, and of course, supply chain's on the front page of every newspaper now. It seems like over the past couple of years, and now it's come full circle by being the main topic at Guelph, LA. So, but it has been a primary focus for our clients. Both the inbound, which I know was talked about earlier, you're bringing product from where it's being sourced from, but then the more important piece, which is the outbound, getting to your customers. And for us, Before the pandemic, we're shipping 1 million parcels a month all around the world. And primarily, we leverage passenger air capacity. So the biggest challenge for us immediately was just capacity. But that capacity challenge evolved over the past 2 years, but it's really all been around capacity, because when 95% of international flights disappeared, all of a sudden we had to rethink how we found capacity. And then, of course, there was labor capacity, because we also have fulfillment centers. So staffing became a challenge for us to be able to fulfill orders for our clients. So when our clients are looking to really ramp up after, let's say, June, July, August 2020, it was really go time. And since then, it's been all about expansion and more and growth. And you know, we've seen some of that slow, but it's more to like pre-COVID growth levels. So we're still growing, there's still challenges, but you know, a lot of brands that we're talking earlier this morning, a lot of our clients, you know, this is what I love about Guelph is you understand that customers are all around the world. It's not the 320 million people here in the United States. It's the over 7 billion people all around the world. And the internet has brought the world community together. It has matched your great brands with consumers all around the globe. Now it's about how do you perform on that delivery experience and that brand promise. And the challenge around capacity became, you know, a really huge issue. So for us, it's all been about creativity. So, you know, we would charter planes before the pandemic for ad hoc projects. Last year, we chartered 400 aircraft to get products all around the world. Before the pandemic, we were doing 1 million parcels a month, shipping all around the world. In April of 2020, that went down to almost 0, and now we're up to 16 million parcels every month that we're shipping all around the world. So the capacity of growth has also been a challenge as we manage our operations and servicing our clients' growth expectations and growth performance. But it has been a tough 2 years, but I think this is really an opportunity for companies that can be creative to implement solutions in real time. Talked a lot about that in the earlier session, about, you know, creativity, being nimble, being flexible, being fast, and working with partners that can get you into that mode of speed rather than holding you back. And I think that's where we and a lot of the other companies that are here have been able to do that, because we can move fast, we can come up with creative solutions. And then ultimately our brands can implement their strategies quickly to launch in new markets, to revise their strategies, because when you look at shipping around the world and the challenges that creates, but you then look at how do I hold inventory in region or in country and implement those strategies in real time, and all those cost calculations have been shifting so much over the past 2 years. It's been really mostly around capacity, but on multiple fronts.
It's a really good, you know, recap, and we heard some of that from Kelly at Reformation earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Just, you know, again, trying to move that product closer to that end consumer. I think, you know, for years, you know, we've been talking about, you know, managing customer experiences, but never has there been such a focus on the post-purchase, you know, the end of that customer experience. I think, you know, when we've been looking at, you know, at re-commerce models, you know, in general, I think it's really fascinating to kind of hear from in GOAT's case. And again, Hamaad, you kind of mentioned the Hong Kong was your first, you know, kind of overseas facility. But tell us a little bit more in terms of how you've been kind of growing that international footprint.
Yeah, so one of the things we do is, you know, we basically have sellers around the globe. And I know that as a manufacturer, or having worked for a manufacturer in the past, you tend to isolate yourself to wherever the manufacturing takes place as your supply base. And if something happens to that location, whether it is, you know, a global event of some other, you know, of some proportion, the stuff that we have going on today with pandemic or war, or what have you, you can quickly lose access to that supply. The cool thing about GOAT is because it's a marketplace, our supply is spread amongst just regular people around the globe. So if something is happening in one part of the world suppressing supply, that same thing is available somewhere else, so we're able to keep that supply moving. Now, when we look at a location and look to expand, we tend to look at where that supply is coming from. So Hong Kong was the first one on the map that bubbled up and said, oh, wow, we've got a lot of supply here. Maybe we should open up a location there. And the reason to open up a location internationally is, again, from a manufacturer standpoint, you want to be close to the buyer. We want to be close to the seller. Right? And so part of the reason is we want them to have an amazing experience. And what I mean by that is they want to be paid out quickly, so they want their transaction to happen quickly. And so when we're close to them, that takes place. And then we start to look at other parts of the map. Where are sellers located? That they're shipping all their stuff to our American locations. Can we shorten that distance for them? So at the end of 2019, we planted a flag in London. And then in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, we opened up in Rotterdam. And then it just started to, one after the other, Singapore, Japan, China. And that list continues to grow this year as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, for those of you who have looked at marketplace models, the extreme focus on the seller side experience.
Yep.
Again, any other things that you guys are doing to really, super please or maybe surprise and delight, some of those sellers?
Yeah, one of the things we definitely want to be able to do is offer them as many options as possible when it comes to shipping. And so we will allow, at times, we'll give them an option. Do you want to have your product picked up? Do you want to have your product shipped into us? So we'll provide you the shipping label. And in other instances, we want to be close to where most of our sellers are, so that, because we charge a seller fee. If you want that lowered so that you make more profit as a seller, you're more than welcome to come into the facility and drop off your product as well. So all of these options, so that once they get hooked with the level of service that you give them, they're not going to the competition.
So Brian, you hear that, obviously, you know Hamaad's, business, very well, but certainly for, other brands, they're at different stages of that international journey. How do you kind of, advise or give counsel, to some of these brands on global expansion? What are the right, kind of issues? Marketplaces, clearly there's this focus on kind of the supply side, but for most of the DTC brands, here in the room, how do you kind of help them understand that journey as they're going from early stage in their international growth to, again, where it becomes a much bigger piece of their overall business?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really comes down to, and you hear it from Hamaad, like they're focused on their supply chain. He's focused on building out better experiences for his sellers and his consumer buyers, but really focusing on the supply chain, because companies don't compete, supply chains compete. And his supply chain is becoming even more nimble, more flexible. He doesn't have the luxury of being able to position inventory closer to the consumers, because that's not even the nature of the entire marketplace. So he has unique challenges. All of our clients have unique challenges. All of you have unique challenges. And it's really all about designing your supply chain to be more competitive against others in your market. And so for some companies, we do talk to them about shipping all around the world. And at some point, you do reach a scale that positioning your inventory in one of our facilities in Melbourne in Australia, or in Hong Kong, or in Amsterdam makes a lot of sense. And I think it's really interesting that how you talked about, or it was actually discussed a lot this morning on sustainability. That's becoming now a factor in the equation. So it's not just cost, it's impact to climate. And this is one of the areas too where, when we talk to clients about international expansion, a lot of times, a lot of things aren't factored in from a cost perspective when you do launch in a new country with your own fulfillment, positioning inventory. I mean, it can be really costly. But what's really interesting on the sustainability front is that there are becoming increasingly viable options to ship around the world that can be sustainable. For me, one of the most important ones and biggest ones is, I mentioned earlier that we use a lot of passenger capacity. United Airlines, over a year ago, has made a commitment to decarbonize, become fully carbon neutral. They're one of the leaders in the United States, and they have made a lot of investments in sustainable fuel. And this is something that's becoming really interesting, because it's even better than a carbon offset, because we're talking about funding the change in fuel for the entire aviation industry. And those early adopters that have come on board are helping to get us to that tipping point where sustainable fuels can now be available around all airports. We're not even close to there yet, but we're starting to get traction. And this can be an option for shippers that use a disintermediated supply chain of like a SEKO logistics. And we're not the only ones, because United Airlines can now be an option to get your product to many locations around the world. And you can help to fund the proliferation of sustainable fuels, which is really a 1-2 punch for sustainability, because it has a more lasting impact on decarbonizing a very carbon reliant industry. But sustainability is definitely a factor in how we advise clients. It's costs around duplication of inventory. It's about site selection as well. But ultimately, I think what we find is that there are more creative options to ship internationally still. During the peak of the pandemic, it was really challenging. But now things are opening up. Capacity is returning. There are flights going to Australia now. There are flights going to a lot of places that shut down. A lot more flights are being introduced in April and May of this year, and we're going to continue to see more and more options. That's going to, I think, shift that focus more to shipping internationally rather than positioning inventory. But every brand is different on that journey, and every brand's supply chain is different too. Where you're sourcing from could have an impact. The size of the products that you're shipping definitely has an impact. Return ratios also have an impact. And all of these things play a factor. So, sometimes it's better to actually keep shipping from the United States, but leveraging our global footprint for a return solution, so that if you have 30–40% returns ratio, you can still have that great consumer experience of refunding at the first scan, because you're leveraging our footprint, but ultimately you're not having to duplicate or triplicate your inventory because you're shipping all from here. And that's why I say every supply chain is different, but what the common theme here is that everyone that is investing and focusing in the supply chain, you're getting more seats at the table, I'm hoping, in your boardrooms when talking about the different creative solutions you can implement to be more competitive and to focus on that brand promise and that delivery experience, because that's what it really comes down to. Speed is a factor. Cost is a factor. Good, fast, and cheap, pick two, right? So it really depends on each individual brand.
When you say having a seat at the strategy table, I think we've seen that consistently over recent years. Where operations and logistics has to be in the room, because that's just so critical. It's great to hear again capacity starting to rise again, because throughout we're certainly hearing nimbleness, agility. I mean that's going to be the name of the game.
I should say, it's still a big issue. We're nowhere near to where we were before COVID. Otherwise, we wouldn't be flying our own planes, which is not something we typically do. But you know what? We'll do it to find capacity for our clients. I mean, that's what it comes down to. You got to pull the trigger. You got to make decisions, because if you delay, you just leave opportunity and room for your competitors to one-up you in an area that you could have dominated. So speed has been really critical, I think, for a lot of companies in the past 2 years. Those that acted fast, those that did that purchase order. We had one client that doubled their purchase orders in March of 2020, and they were in furniture, so they saw something that a lot of others didn't. So when a lot of other people were out of stock, they weren't. It's just, I really think being bold, making quick decisions, and having good, nimble partners around you to support you is a big recipe for success for cross-border international e-commerce shipping.
Yeah, really interesting. Hamaad, let's talk some of the regions. You kind of mentioned the Rotterdam facility. How has that kind of played into Brexit? I mean, because this was started before Brexit, correct?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, in 2020, in about February or so, we realized we'd have to open up this location before Brexit went into effect. And so, went out to Europe to kind of isolate a location. And Rotterdam is usually a great location. But we picked Rotterdam more than just it's a great logistics location. We have a competitor who decided to go to a logistics-centric city. And we, on the other hand, decided to kind of balance, and we do this everywhere where we go, we balance where our sellers are to where the logistics take place, but then also we overlay where a lot of our authenticators are, right? And this is kind of our secret sauce. And what we do is we verify that the Air Jordan 1s that you're buying are truly authentic, and we find those people that we train, but they have to be, streetwear. They have a love for streetwear and sneakers and hip hop culture and basketball culture. And so when you look for those people, they don't live in the outskirts of Eindhoven or Venlo or something like that. They live in Rotterdam. They live in Amsterdam. And so we kind of balance all of that. If you put a Venn diagram of those three things, we try to pick the best location based on that. That's why you find us in the heart of the city of Tokyo, as opposed to on the outskirts of the city, for that very reason. And so when it came to Brexit, we decided to open up in Rotterdam. However, the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden you couldn't travel to Europe. Luckily, before Brexit went into effect at the end of 2020, the UK still fell under EU rules when it came to being able to cross borders. And so I used that to my advantage. And the UK was the only country that allowed Americans in at that time in about July, August of 2020. Took a flight to the UK, quarantined for 14 days in London, jumped on a Eurostar with my fingers crossed that France, Belgium, and the Netherlands would let me cross through. And luckily they did, because flights weren't allowed. And so I took the train, and if I couldn't take the train, I would have swam across, But yeah, got to Rotterdam and stayed there for 6 weeks, opened that location. And then, and back then it was 3 people. And today it's pushing 60 or 70 people.
That's great. And again, as we see re-commerce, business models continue to grow. I mean, roles like the authenticators, right? Again, that's really interesting that they factor in quite heavily into some of your decisions, right? Because you talked about Tokyo and the facility you have there, kind of being very urban, dense. Was that very much, kind of in line with?
Exactly, right. So we picked a location between Tokyo and Kawasaki, and the reason was we needed to be close to authenticators, but we also needed a logistics-centric building that was close to, for example, the company we use for our inbound shipments over there, Yamato, being close to them so that we get our shipments in the morning, being close to our outbound shipment, partners as well. And then also being close to the sellers. We want them to be able to come to our building, drop off if they need to, because it's such a densely populated area. So you'll find this in Tokyo, Hong Kong, Singapore. And so we try to position ourselves kind of in the center of those considerations.
Mm-hmm. How about the Canadian market? You heard of some of the earlier speakers. We're talking about Canada, later on. Is that a big market, for Go?
Yeah. So Canada is interesting. As a Canadian, if I speak poorly of Canada, I feel like I have permission to. But Canada's interesting because it's not like here. You go from San Diego to Santa Barbara. It's one big metropolis. You have cities like Calgary and Edmonton, but then there's nothing really in between. And so I bring that up because the cost of shipping goes up exponentially as a result. And so Canada's a great market for us, both on the seller side and on the buyer side. Currently, we ship in and out. Our rates are so good for shipping to and from Canada that we ship from the US. And so we leverage both of our facilities on either coasts that we have and ship in and out over there. We've considered having a location in Canada, and if we did, we'd probably have to go the route of maybe splitting that to help keep shipping costs down, right? Because if you have a seller in Vancouver and you have a buyer in Montreal, that's an expensive box to move. Would much rather move it from Toronto to Montreal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's certainly what we've seen, for other businesses that have a strong Canadian presence. I mean, we've heard, so many brands focusing on their core markets. I mean, certainly, are you seeing something like that, too, Brian, from the SEKO business?
Well, with Canada, absolutely. We originally started our international e-commerce shipping solution in Australia because it's a very isolated country geographically, and with the rise of the internet, now consumers in Australia had access to all the SKUs and inventory that we all have available to us in the US. So they built a really great solution on shipping from the US to Australia. We solved first kind of one of the toughest lanes, one of the most challenging ones. And then from there, we solved UK, we solved Greater China, and we never really looked at Canada because there were so many options. But recently we've come to realize, especially with the pandemic, that all options aren't necessarily great or meet the standards of every brand. I mean, we're happy to announce, the press release hasn't come out yet, but now we actually have an alternative DTC solution cross-border from the United States into Canada, not with companies that you're familiar with, but leveraging our technology, leveraging our infrastructure, leveraging our team, because it is still the #1 cross-border lane for a lot of brands. So again, we're all about not just doing the easy button. And for a lot of brands, Canada was an easy button with what options have been available in the market for years, but we can all do better. And Canadians deserve better. And
thank you.
Because I share the stage with 2 Canadians.
Hamaad, last words, because I know we're a little over time here. What's next, for GOAT? What's next for you in the operations side?
Yeah, so last year we really focused on Europe and expanding there, and even this year. The first part of this year, but now we've kind of turned our focus to Southeast Asia and East Asia in terms of setting up locations and really building out people infrastructure. So one of the things that was kind of I would say a constraint on us is we would use our LA headquarter team to go open these locations. And so now we've built kind of the bench, if you will, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in London, in Rotterdam, to help us launch all these other locations. And then just going back to the locations we've opened, we would just go open and then go to the next, go open and go to the next. Now we're going to go back and just refine and become more optimized and efficient.
That's great. Well, that's where we're going to welcome you back here maybe a year or so from now and hear how it's going in Southeast Asia.
Fantastic.
But with that, I want to thank these guys tremendously for joining us on stage.